This is an Irreverent podcast. Check out irreverent.fm for shows from all our friends. Hello and welcome to Exvangelical, a show exploring the world inside and outside the evangelical subculture. I'm your host, Blake Chastain. My guest this week is Rohadi Nagassar. Rohadi is an author and a podcaster, and recently published the new book, When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. We recorded this conversation back in February, so you won't hear us talk about any of the world events that have happened since then, but this is a well-timed release of the show because Rohadi's new book has been published and is available for purchase now. We talk in this conversation about Rohadi's own journey of faith and belonging and identity, and I can't wait for you to hear it. If you want to support the show, you can do so by subscribing to my newsletter, The Post-Evangelical Post, which is a Substack publication. Exvangelical is a production of The Post-Evangelical Post, and you can support it at $4, $6, or $8 a month. And at any of those rates, you will receive ad-free podcast feeds, subscriber-only content, access to a Discord, and more coming in the future. Every single subscription does matter. It does help me take steps forward towards making this my full-time work. So please, if you are able, please support this work via a subscription. I donate 25% of my net proceeds each month to organizations that serve populations harmed by white evangelicalism, including White Homework and the Religious Exemption Accountability Project. You can learn more about that at postevangelicalpost.com. This episode was edited by Elizabeth Nordenholt and Podcat Audio. Thank you very much. All right, let's get into it. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Exvangelical. My guest today is Rohadi Nagassar. Rohadi is the host of the podcast Faith in a Fresh Vibe, which just wrapped up a season on deconstruction, in which I had the privilege of being a guest on. He's also an author with a forthcoming book, When We Belong, Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins, coming soon from Herald Press. Rohadi, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Blake.
Thanks for coming on. I really enjoyed talking to you on your show and wanted to have you on mine. This is a show that's really just pretty much rooted in personal stories. And to that end, I like to start at the beginning of people's stories that come on the show. So to kick things off, I'd love to hear a little bit about where you grew up and what your sort of first exposures to religion or church were like.
Well, thanks for inviting me here into your space. It's always fun to... I think you reached out and said, "Hey, I want to reciprocate," and that's oddly rare, at least in my experience. Maybe I'm not interesting, but the folks who do that to exchange stories, and that's a really powerful tool that we have, and one that I think is really critical. And one of the obvious pieces of this whole deconstruction evangelical movement, and I criticize pieces of it, but one thing you can't strip away from anyone is their story.
Yeah, for sure.
Folks using tools to tell their story, and that's what is so valuable, and it gives other people life. So I appreciate you asking that question and not starting off, with the glib evangelical bit fascination, whatever you want to call it, of tell me your what do they say, conversion story, or when you came to Christ, or give me whew.
That's too loaded in my opinion.
Well, mine was always it's whatever. I was a kid. End of story. And I try to add pieces to but when I went to seminary, anyways. My story, I grew up in Calgary. Calgary's 3.5 hours north of the Montana border. Known for the 1988 Olympics, probably known for Banff, which is an hour and a bit away, more so than what Calgary has. Calgary is often confused or called, probably only by us, as the Houston of the North, Houston of Canada. Alberta is... when Alberta's a hot mess, which is the province, so we don't have states here, we have provinces, and Alberta is if things are going really bad, we make fun of ourselves and call it the Florida of Canada. But if things are normal, then it's the Texas of Canada. So it's usually the Texas of Canada. Rural Alberta would be very similar to any rural region, really. in America, very conservative. We can talk a little bit of the difference of evangelicalism between Canada and America, but definitely conservative in their faith. But in the city centers, the two main cities in Edmonton and Calgary, we were metropolitan, increasingly becoming more multi-ethnic, although very white. And so when I grew up in Calgary, and I've been here almost my whole life, the city was much smaller and, of course, very, very white. I was born in Trinidad. To situate yourself, that's the last island in the Caribbean and just off the coast of Venezuela, and came to Canada when I was 2. My dad and I immigrated over here. My mom was born in Calgary. My mom's side, we have roots going back. I'm all the Asians, so West Indian from Trinidad, but on my mom's side, Chinese and Japanese. And the Japanese side goes back just before both Chinese and Japanese in between the world wars. The Japanese side, of course, went through internment. The Chinese side, I have roots in Alberta that go back 100 years, which is nothing compared to the lands of which I'm on, which they're treaty lands here, and that's how we mark the Indigenous territories. It's Treaty 7 territory and Métis Region 3, where I'm situated. The Blackfoot, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda Nation are the tribes, we call them nations here, around this space, this city I call Calgary. So that's a little bit of where I'm from, or my people. Did you want to know, was the second part of that about church?
Yeah. I think geography is such an interesting part of people's stories. And just one of the reasons why I find that an interesting place to start is, I come from Indiana, which is, it's basically a place that if you're white, like a lot of the history was erased. And so of the indigenous population and things like that, if you compare the Midwest to some of the older parts of the United States, like the East Coast, it feels very young, but that's just because we don't have the history. Nonetheless, like all those different things inform how we start to develop an identity and the type of people we come from, the type of place we come from. I think for the purposes of these types of shows, like the ones you and I do, I think it's also important, to dial down and also say, this was the type of faith place that I was brought up in. And I think, so that's why I put those two questions together on the show, really, is just, where did you grow up? And also, what was that sort of first venture into church like, whether it was there with you for as long as you can remember, or if it was something that came into your life later.
Yeah, no, and that's a good connection to draw those two together. And then there's so much more behind, like Alberta and Calgary, they're similar in that the history is not as deep. Even Canada as a country, as this space, it's not that old, right? And so to draw back further, both the stories of the land before you, but also your own people, it starts to add add pieces to who you are now, which is important when you do work around, let's say, reclamation. And so for myself, growing up in Calgary as a new immigrant, as I'm brown, there's no way I'm passing as anything else, yet having all these different intersections of ethnicities, Asian ethnicities, our work was to assimilate. You want to survive, it was to assimilate as new immigrants. Now, my mom and all of her family, that wasn't the work of assimilation. They're from here. She's from here, right? And so that was more now the work of facing the constant pressures of cultural whiteness. So it's within that, and I wouldn't have never named it as such, but it's within that context of a conservative city at the turn in the mid 80s, when it was probably the same in the States when interest rates were like 13, 15%, couldn't buy a house, all that stuff. So yeah, in the 80s, we wound up at a local church. How we came to faith. Here's the story. Your faith story. How you came to my aunt came to faith because I guess some evangelicals dragged her to church when she was a reservist in the army, which is so weird because so few people in Canada, like there's no big sentiment for the army here. Militarism is not a thing here, but for some reason my aunt was in the reserves and someone took her to church and she found Jesus, came home on fire for Jesus. And like, I'm using these terms because that's exactly what it was, and dragged my mom to church. In fact, dragged a whole family to church, my dad as well. And my dad hasn't been in the church picture really, but at the start he was, which is really fascinating because once we went to a larger, probably evangelical church, we then switched by both relationship and also because it was the closest to this small white steepled church down the road from us. It was close. It was ultra charismatic. It was charismatic fundamentalist. It was, to use the term, wild. Now, being a kid, all that wildness sort of skipped me. And I was really only concerned about whether or not I would get the latest insert of the picture Bible, of which we can deconstruct the picture Bible too. But that was like the biggest thing for me growing up. My dad had to encounter all the fundamentalism, anti-science, literal 7-day creations. Man, I remember the VHS tapes in the house. The guys coming over trying to convince dad and mom that, the earth was created in 7 days. Look at these footprints of, why do I remember this? These footprints. Do you remember the VHS? I don't know if it's had like a little peach color on it. Anyways, we switched from that space, I think again by relationship. We knew someone, and that was I'm going to guess all white church, to an evangelical, proper evangelical church, and then stayed in that tradition. That tradition is the one that has formed me. All my formative years growing up is within what I would say now, white evangelicalism. I wouldn't have used that term at the time, but that in Canada would have looked almost the exact same as everything in the US, just not as militant, not as connected to military, to flag, but really we were singing the exact same songs. We were doing the exact same Bible studies. Like, oh man, what was the one I just saw on Twitter someone shared and it brought back all the memories? Blackaby, Experiencing God.
Yeah, Experiencing
God. Do you ever remember?
I did that.
And when
one
I say
youth
that,
group.
you can picture exactly what that front cover looked like,
Yeah, it was black with like gold letters. Black with like gold letters. I think there was
and it was what, Moses on the front or Abraham? Anyways, ruggedly handsome white Abraham was on the front. Yeah, we had that. We had all that same stuff. So the same stuff that shaped and formed evangelicals in the U.S. Same.
Did you get all the lovely, like purity culture and all sorts of other stuff like within? I mean, because it sounds like you were in the same sort of time frame that I was probably working into. Like I was born in '83, so my youth group years were the end of the '90s, which was peak Ica stating goodbye, every man's battle type business. And like, I'm by no means I don't have like a ton of familiarity with Canada's history or anything like that. So I am very curious about how things were either similar or different. You mentioned that it wasn't as militant, which I actually happen to have the Jesus and John Wayne book right here, which is
there it is.
Yeah, which is all about. There's a whole chapter on militancy here in the U.S.
Yeah, so the fantastic book, but not really resonating in terms of its central metaphor of John Wayne.
Really? Yeah.
So because we didn't have a lot of John Wayne. Maybe a generation did, but that connection piece that's so crucial to John Wayne, like maybe the Lone Ranger, Wild Wild West kind of thing would resonate, but because we lack that connection to military and that imperialist arm, we don't associate our Christianity for evangelicals with that in the same way. Evangelicals in Canada right now would probably be at best 8%, but I think it's closer to under 5% of all of the entire population. So right off the bat, it's a minority group. So the posture for evangelicals here is one more of holding on for dear life, really protecting a way of life rather than operating as some type of authority. So if you don't have the numbers, you can't operate as gatekeeper. I mean, you'd still try theologically, of course, but you don't have as many tools, and you certainly don't have the connections to power, particularly political power. Although we're seeing a shift around there. Canada is different in terms of its governments and its politics. We don't have a two-party system, really. We have multiple. So our conservatives would take about a third of the vote every time. And then the rest of the country, roughly, is left-leaning or left of center. So 2/3. So culturally, that's also different as well.
Yeah, so to ask a follow-up question first about the sort of religious sociological thing that you mentioned about it being a smaller percentage of the population. Does that mean that evangelicals tend to be more ecumenical with other types of forms of Christianity? Because a lot of times here in the US, like evangelicals sort of mind their own business. They run the roost. They basically run the Republican Party.
Now they did. They never used to. What was that other?
I mean, it's absolutely not. It's at this point now, historically, where the GOP basically caters to powerful evangelical concerns. And here in the US, we still have basically somewhere between 18 to 25%, they say, are white evangelicals of the US population. So that's a very high demographic number here in the US. So I'm curious, when it comes to how evangelicals relate to other Christians, do they still have that sort of, they discount that style of Christianity?
Totally. There's if you want to slam Canadian evangelicals, it's that they don't have a unique thought. And I'll interchange between they and we, depending on where I situate myself in the story.
That's right? Fair enough. Yeah.
But they don't have a unique thought, really. Maybe some try, but ultimately the formative cultural aspects all come from the US. Can you name a Canadian evangelical? So maybe there's one.
I'm trying to think. I mean, erstwhile
that guy.
The erstwhile evangelical, Josh Harris, used to be evangelical. He moved to Vancouver a while ago, but he was American.
Yeah, he's an American. So I barely know and haven't read those books, but have read all the others. So would they play? No, they would pull in the same idea that they are the gatekeepers of all truth, of their own truth. I mean, everyone has that, which is fine. But the problem is when you draw a hard line on this is the truth. Canada are at one point at the turn of just after the war, rather, as a percentage of population went to Sunday service at a higher percentage than America. This is all mainline though. And then in the 60s, there's a fracturing. So the country has been shaped and formed by mainline traditions, Catholic and Anglican, or there's a United Church of Canada being another one. And so that's what's still around, but Canada now is sort of in between, or very similar to some of the metro areas in that we are post-Christian in between America and Europe in terms of where we are culturally. So although there's probably affiliation for a now dwindling majority, how many people actually go to a service, pre-COVID, but go to a service weekly? It's not a lot of Canadians, maybe a quarter, probably less. I'd have to look that one up. But it's through mainline connections, still strong Catholic presence. There's still separate school boards. So the Catholic Church still runs a separate school board in most provinces, as far as I know, and almost all of them, in fact. So that influence is still there. But if you were to talk to the average Canadian, it's one of those spiritual but not religious conversations. It's going to be the growing minority of nuns, very similar to the US. the nuns, NONES, and the folks who have no religion. That's what the box they're going to check on the census.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah, nothing in particular or nuns. Yeah, interesting. That's really, really interesting. I think I did have another question from a more political perspective, but maybe we'll loop back to that. Let's actually get back to your own
kiss dating goodbye. Okay, let's go back to never read it.
Okay, good. It's good. If you've never read it, that's great.
But that was the thing, though. Like, so we were born in the same year. The youth group and all that, because I was part of such a small church, and my mom wasn't deep in, like, absolutely God-fearing woman, but didn't drag me to all the evangelical stuff, didn't force me to do that. And because youth group was so small, like, a lot of that just skipped me. I was too busy playing sports or whatever. So trying to be a DJ. That's nice. Another podcast. So I did skip the purity culture stuff. You still got the ethic around sex, of course. In Canada around that time, and by around that time, I mean coming of age, so 18 for us here. That was around the time where the world was going to fall apart because same-gendered marriage, same-sex marriage was going to come into effect federally. And so evangelicals were working really hard around that in Canada. So that took a lot of focus. This just in Canada didn't fall apart. We're doing great. It's actually fantastic. Evangelicals might have been wrong on that one. Well, they are.
Yeah.
So that's the dating piece of it. I was definitely around all that. It touched me, but when I see the stories around deconstruction or ex-evangelical, it's like, yikes. Like, because the world around us didn't look like that, it was easy to escape the clutches of that type of abuse.
Well, that's great. I mean, like yeah. The fact that you don't have that to contend with is
that I can remember. Like, maybe it's coming. I don't know. Oh boy.
Hopefully you have the resources to address it if it's coming for you now.
I would just assume a lot of anger.
So after, you have these experiences at charismatic churches and other evangelical churches in Calgary, and you have this family dynamic, including your aunt and your parents. Was there a point, like in your adolescent or adult years, that you started to, in either direction, like you were like, okay, I'm sort of done with this, or, oh, this is interesting, I want to explore this a little more? Where did that start to go when you got a little older?
It was neither of those, but I like your phrase of, that's interesting. I've never really thought about it through that lens. That's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, to me, I think that's people have like, they're prone to religiosity or they're not, it's not, it's even.
I like the inquiry of that though.
Mm-hmm.
As I process now and have been for the past 10, 15 years, you don't need to tell a person of color, especially black and brown bodies, that they don't fit in white evangelicalism. We just know in our bodies, but sometimes you can't actually pinpoint it. You can't name it. Some folks, they're just born really into that type of juxtaposition. But growing up in white evangelicalism, really, I was never permitted full belonging. And so my hunch around that, so maybe this is the inquiry part, was that why is this church so incompetent at connecting with people who don't look like it? And that was through the lens of evangelism. Because remember, like, the biggest thing from church was if someone new came, like, so rare, but like if someone new came, would blow our minds. Like, what on earth? Because that was the chief possibility coming to life. Like, bring people into the service was your role. Let the clergyman do the rest. We didn't call them clergymen. And so I was always looking around, not just at my little church, but it certainly shaped and formed me. But I'll get to that. it was always a question of incompetence. And that's the word I was using. Like, we just don't know how to connect with people who don't know the stories. We'll maybe attract some lapsed Christians or someone who moved to the city, right? That's how most churches grow. Transfers, births, or lapsed. So you came back. Oh, immigration is the third one of already church people. And that's how churches grow. You have to read my other book for that. That's not even my data. I'll send you the data. So we never grew through conversions, like no evangelical church does. And I think when the pin hit the floor was when I went to one of the big churches. Very few mega churches in Canada, very few. And the mega church to us, like in my city, would be maybe a couple thousand at that church. And that's a big, like gigantic, can't even conceptualize. That's huge. Going to that church, to their baptism service, and hearing the stories and realizing not one was a story of someone who encountered Jesus as an adult, but they were all either kids, which is fine, or people who grew up in the church getting baptized. It's like, wait a minute, like even the big churches struggle with that. So I think what changed me was the inability to belong as a racialized minority, but not naming it as such initially. So I went to university right after, didn't do any Bible stuff, but I knew, and here it comes, I had a calling. I just knew it, right? And it's like, sometimes you just know. And this was my weird moment of, you just know. And so I had a calling to go into ministry. What kind? I don't know. So all that did was set up going to seminary after university. So in seminary and being able to visit other churches, evangelicals still, but larger churches, and see how they work, I started to shape around the time, the first wave of deconstruction, before it was hot, when Brian McLaren and all those cats were together. They were all together. Who's the other one? Mars Hill, the two Mars Hill guys.
Yeah, well,
Mark Driscoll and Rob Bell.
Rob Bell.
All those homies were all doing, a bunch of white guys, but all these homies were doing the same thing. They were asking questions about what's happening culturally with the church. And so that struck me in that moment, and reading Brian McLaren during that time, as I was questioning not my faith, but the issue of belonging in church and incompetence, led me down a path initially of mission. So that brought me into a space, and being an entrepreneur, into the whole emergent. And then as that kind of pittered out, the missional movement, which was a little bit more theological. And being an entrepreneur, the only choice I had was try to do worship, because I'm built like a good evangelical. My giftings when I was coming out of seminary, and still today, although now I've grown a different wolf, was lead pastor. Now, not the big type A personality, but those were where my skills are. But there's no way in a white city and in evangelicalism, where there's virtually no multi-ethnic churches. Might be similar in the US, but that's totally the case here. There was absolutely no way I was going to be able to live into my gifts in a church. I would have to church plant. So that's the direction I went and have gone and have stayed in ever since. But that was also tied to this idea of mission, that if we simply solved the thinking and the function of the church around mission and how it reached out to people who didn't look like it, we would solve the problem. Didn't name it like this, but now I would, the problem of belonging for those on the margins. And it took me a few more years after that to realize, okay, maybe there's a theological thing here, but missional is still dominated by white men in its thought process, and also in church planting is all white men generally. Those things are shifting now, but I've come to a distinct place now which processes matters of belonging through a racialized lens. To say, actually, you don't belong because there is a deep power of racialization, of division along ethnic boundaries that is bigger than the problem of mission. And so that fast forwarded from seminary, however, 15 plus years ago up until today. But that was the inquiry. Those were the questions that catalyzed why think of something outside of what clearly does not welcome or want you. I wasn't going to leave my faith because that didn't seem to escape me for some reason, but the church most certainly did.
Yeah, that's such an interesting way to frame it. And I think a lot of people relate to that, whether it's because they are also a person of color that was brought up in these predominantly white or white-led spaces, and they never felt comfortable there for all the reasons you mentioned, or just because they maintain their faith even as shitty things may have happened to them, or both. I really appreciate your comments there. Do you think now, like you mentioned, that like the emergent church movement, which started in the early 2000s and then followed by the missional thing. I actually hadn't heard that term in a while. Like that sort of took
serious. Missional is older than emergent.
Yeah, no, but to me, they're a little linked in my head and I think it's because I'm trying to look at my bookshelf, which I have my copy of A New Kind of Christian somewhere. And I think the slipcover of the book has all these adjectives on it. And I believe one of them was missional. Oh, and I just have that in my head.
Good catch.
So anyways, you mentioned that you like were tracking with some of these movements, and then you over time started to develop this racialized lens. And I'm curious if you think that other parts of Christianity, including some of the white people that are involved in that, are starting to catch up to where people are. And because I feel like in the last, at least here in the United States, if you've been extremely online since like 2014, when Michael Brown was killed, and then all of the racial awareness that's been built up, we're at this point now where white people are finally being viewed and criticized through that racial lens. And I think that it's long overdue. But that's why we're seeing pushback here in the United States regarding critical race theory and other things. Do you think that is conscious enough? Like when people have conversations regarding church or regarding, I want to go eventually towards deconstruction in particular, because that's where, for better or worse, like that's sort of where a lot of my work lands. When I started, I didn't really use that term, but I think a culture has sort of evolved around it really rapidly. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back to
what are we talking about? Racism.
Yeah, and just the way you said, you started looking at it through this racialized lens of being able to create communities where you can belong, as well as understand your relationship to the ones where you felt like you didn't belong, if I'm understanding you right.
No, that's partially the story. I mean, my story, however, is unique in the sense that you don't need to tell, unless, and it's not, especially in America, that often, let's say a black folks, that they need to be alert of their racialization. Like, no, that's just something, right? And that's something I knew as well, but hadn't articulated or named as such in my church experience. And because I don't fit ethnic traditions, because that's where you would go if you could fit Chinese or Japanese, you would test maybe a white church experience, but you would probably stick with your ethnicity when it comes to community or church, or at least you would have that option. Now, young folks, second gen, third gen, might leave to try out new things in white evangelicalism, but then they get there and realize they are going to be faced with different problems around whiteness and basically not being represented or seen for who they are in those spaces. So they either leave the faith or they go back to ethnic traditions. I don't have the ethnic tradition to go back to. I'm too brown for Chinese church. Don't speak Chinese. Too brown for Japanese church. There's no Caribbean church that would have West Indians in it around me. Maybe in Toronto, not here. The Caribbean churches that would be here would be black traditions. So where did you go? Like, where do you go? So that took me some time to become more alert to what was going on around me. But in terms of church culture in general, and I kind of use this as Canada is further ahead in some ways, I would contend that when it comes to aspects, except for how we're dealing with our colonial history with Indigenous folks, that we're behind America because we don't have a border with Mexico. So we don't have a significant Black population here. And if we do, this is new Black immigrants, right? This is not Toronto or Nova Scotia, where there are established Black communities. Canadian churches, Canadian Christians have barely come to reckon, especially evangelicals, with racialization or segregation in their churches. You can barely talk about it. The catalyst would have been maybe Charlottesville and certainly the Black Lives movements surrounding George Floyd. And all of a sudden, there was a deluge of evangelicals really interested in this subject. But of course, as we know how it goes for most things around justice, most of it is performative. How have evangelicals specifically embodied new direction in terms of dealing with their own whiteness or their own formation in white supremacy? I'll say that COVID, its continued existence, has given these churches a pass where congregations were crying out and saying, we got to do something because we never have around George Floyd the pandemic sticking around gave these churches an excuse to not deal or even start dealing with these issues. So here, I think it's something that congregations that are dwindling and closing, there's an exodus happening. They are asking for some shifts. They're asking for some leadership around matters of justice, specifically justice for marginalized Christians of color, but also Indigenous folks. And then that opens the door to other spaces of marginalization. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of shifts here in the same way that there's digging in the heels. Can you really imagine a congregation or a denomination that can barely let women in, that won't even broach or has in fact made renewed stances banning same-gendered marriages? Do you think that these churches, like to be crass, white people are part of the LGBTQ community, right? When we talk about Black or brown or Indigenous bodies, we're talking you have to go even deeper, perhaps, and hit a foundation of white supremacy. Man, if you can't even talk about letting women in the door, how are you going to go down and contend with even deeper problems? Now, perhaps those aren't deeper problems. There's no oppression Olympics, but that's the space where I think evangelicalism in Canada is at, but that also is a reflection of evangelicalism elsewhere. So yes, there's some good shifts happening. Yes, I always feel good when I look at new generations coming up and I'm like blown away by the leadership that they're offering and the types of things that they're talking about and dealing with. And it's like, wow, like if I was doing this stuff 20 years ago, like no way I would have. And so that gives me a lot of hope. But I come from a position where I don't really care what the denomination or what evangelicalism does. It doesn't touch me. It doesn't impact me. I don't get paid by it. I never have been paid by it. It formed me, so I'm an expert in it. But I don't care if it dies because I'm too busy over here doing a new thing. And there are more people taking a dream to do a new thing, knowing that it's going to be imperfect, but grant the possibility for life. I can't imagine giving my life into evangelicalism in hopes that maybe they will contend with their white supremacy, because I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I really liked what you had to say there at the end about that. You gave me an opportunity for a really good segue here because you mentioned how like evangelicalism formed you, but you're not really interested in continuing it. Like you don't have an investment in perpetuating.
That's a good word. Yeah, investment is a good word.
Yeah, you don't have this investment in perpetuating the institution of evangelicalism, especially predominantly white evangelicalism, because of the failings that you mentioned and the fact that that is, when it comes down to it, like the fact that white evangelicalism is so reticent to reckon with its white supremacy, like that's a lot of emotional work. You know, I couldn't have even recognized that and vocalize that in the way that I'm able to now without being able to do that work. Nonetheless, I really like the way you said that, because I think it sort of gets to the heart of what my particular project is on this show and what's animated me to do it for the number of years that I have, which is this thing formed us. But and there should be spaces to process how the consequences of how it formed us, for good or for bad or for neutral or whatever. But a lot of the focus is on bad or crappy stuff. And that's what a lot of deconstruction type content that's blossomed in the last few years. As you mentioned, as you said, like there were people that were doing this before. There were people like Brian McLaren. It was really the people that you can point to were the people that could get book deals in the 2000s and the 90s and before. And now we have social media, so people can share their stories without needing a book deal.
Isn't that something?
And so
look at us. Look at us now.
Look at us go. We're doing it. So, but with deconstruction, it like I have my own sort of theories that's why I'm working on a book now about how these spaces now that are primarily online spaces, they sort of happen at this accelerated rate. And there's a couple of things that even with our best efforts to influence them for good, you know, norms are created or that sort of thing. So I'm curious, like how what your read is on this sort of deconstruction spaces that have grown up here and really in the English speaking West. That's all I can really speak to, because that's all I can literally understand without a lot more effort on my part. Sort of in the English speaking West, about how we're all reckoning with evangelicalism. How do you approach it? You just did a season on it. What are your sort of thoughts about where that is right now? And
yeah. I mean, I got some thoughts. I know you got some thoughts. I know on the on the episode I had you on, we talked a little bit about this because I have a critique to deconstruction. We'll come back to the notion of online space because I think there's something. Well, there's obviously something there. Deconstruction space, yeah. English speaking, sure. I would add white English speaking for sure. That's what it is. It is dominated by whiteness, ex-evangelical in particular. And I've had to sit with that a little bit because there's a reality demographically that white voices are going to dominate that space. But if I just went through a whole spiel on how white evangelicals are not going to be able to contend with their white supremacy, like if you've been on this earth however many years and you're just shaped without you even knowing you've been shaped by cultural whiteness. Like if I have to deal with my whiteness and white supremacy, man, I don't know how much you're going to have to deal with it, right? Especially for white folks. So that just takes time, all that to say. So I've been critical of deconstruction as a movement in a sense that it is repeating the same problems of institutional whiteness in that white voices are dominating. And that's not going to get you away from the root problem of white supremacy. That's not to say, and so we started this whole podcast episode on story. That's not to say that everyone can't be or shouldn't be sharing, telling, getting their story out there, because not only is that cathartic release, but it's also going to give hope to others who resonate with that story. So from that, I would go down and say, well, the reason why these hashtags are so dominated by white voices is cultural, is a racialization thing. But oh man, like look at how many look at how many people white evangelicalism harmed. Like, whoa, that's just, we're barely scratching the surface. And again, I don't care about the institution, but when the institution comes to fight back to delegitimize a movement or to say that your pain isn't real, like get out, man. What's going on there other than the attack of an inherited power and privilege that you would decry a movement that is merely sharing the broken hearts of all the people you harmed? So in that sense, like the entire movement is filled with stories of goodness. Hurtful stories, broken stories, but these are the little pieces that start repair, I think. Like that start of the journey unto restoration. But I do think we have to be intentional with drawing in voices from the margins to paint a picture of a better way, or else we'll just wind up being like, oh, that's so great. You're so hip and progressive now. And you like, it doesn't matter to me if you're conservative, progressive, both folks are struggling to contend with their white supremacy. And not just white folks either. Like we see how Asian Americans and Asian folks have been reminded over the pandemic that we come with the terms and conditions too. But we've been really, really cool with just upholding white supremacy so long as we get a little bit of the cut. And all the anti-Asian racism that we're seeing crop up, or rather just come back out into the forefront. It's always been there. Reminds us we come with the terms and conditions. So I don't know if you'll see voices in the deconstruction or ex-evangelical movement that are people of color, Black, Indigenous. Like we weren't there, really. We were adjacent. It was not the white, we don't use that term, evangelical church. It was the Chinese evangelical church. Now we call them, right? It was the Japanese evangelical or the Vietnamese, all these ethnic churches. We got our own problems to deal with, and a lot of them were inherited, but that's going to be, I don't know, is that a different hashtag or what? But
yeah, I mean, and as far as the hashtag goes, like the understanding of how that catches on or like goes viral is sort of beyond me. But but to your point, it is dominated by that because it's sort of what it's related to. But I sort of see, and this is just my own perspective, see that, and I don't disagree. Like a lot of the known voices are white, and there is work that needs to be done by white people. And at the same time, like the existence of that doesn't mean necessarily that there is not or should not be some other more inclusive term if that is appropriate at some point, or like, you know, some other hashtag that comes along. Because to me, it seems like there's like this constellation of them. Like The Witness did a hashtag campaign last year called Leave Loud for Black Christians.
Leave Loud, yeah. And that was quite successful.
Yeah, of like leave loud, make your point when you leave these white evangelical spaces, you know. Church 2, empty the pews, like they all have these different functions. But do you relate like the general term deconstruction to that sort of whiteness too? Because like that's like, to me, like an even more general term, because like some people will say like Oh, that's got to do with Derrida and like literary
Yeah.
deconstruction.
And you, and you're just like, okay, nerd, thanks. Like, no, like I was, and then I realized as I was interviewing David Hayward, the Naked Pastor, as he was talking about Derrida, and then I realized in that moment, it's like, oh my gosh, I read on grammatology in seminary. And and I kind of forgot about it, but that shaped me. And I remember using, like a seminary nerd, Derrida. He has, I don't know what he would classify them as, but uses language. He uses the term language to describe meta narratives. And I was trying to, what is wrong with me? I was trying to explain this concept of different cultural worlds to an elders board at a white evangelical church when I was in seminary. What was I thinking? Holy moly. Oh my gosh, I was that guy.
The framework probably wasn't there for them.
The framework wasn't there for me. Like, are you kidding? Probably read like 16 pages of this Derrida book and like, oh yeah, language, deconstruction. Yeah. You know what? I appreciate you sharing on Exvangelical, and for you to create something like that and to see where it goes, and realizing like you can't contain or constrain this thing, but it's become like something beyond your wildest imagination. I can't conceptualize. How many mentions on TikTok did you say?
At this point, it's like 650 million like impressions of or views.
That's wild. That's crazy. Wild. I mean, that sounds like more people than there are on the planet, but like that's wild.
Yeah, it's definitely nuts. And like, and to me, like, but to me, like, most of those people don't, 99% of those people don't relate that term or that hashtag.
What's 1% of 650 million? Like, I'll take it.
But it is like probably 99.9%. Like, but
no, you know what? It is something though, right, Blake? It's the creation of a movement. It is a cultural push that not even so. I mean, if you watch your social media or even like every time Christianity Today says something stupid, right? It's always like, oh my gosh, like, why are you pressing? They don't know how to deal with the size of this cultural movement that has been catalyzed, of which is going in all these different directions, like you said. And yeah, I don't decry it whatsoever, in the same way that I'm not calling for the destruction of the white evangelical church. Like, my hope is not that it burns to the ground. I just know institutions don't change very fast, and it will probably die. And I'm not going to shed a tear. That's fine. But
yeah.
So your question on the constellations, though.
Yeah. And really, I mean, just more about like, I'm curious about people's relation to different terms. Like some people I've noticed, like some content creators of color that are in this space don't like to use terms like deconstruction or exvangelical for the very reasons that you've delineated. And I think that's valid. And they prefer terms like decolonization. And so to me, one of the ideas I'm exploring is basically, because of the way these platforms work, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, they expose you to these ideas and these things based on engagement. And if you engage with them, you get more. And then eventually you get overexposed to them. And like, it leads to like a type of linguistic burnout. Like, you literally
it sounds like a chapter in your book there.
Yeah, it is. I mean, I have a chapter about how social media works and how media affects us. And to me, that's really fascinating. And like, it's never like my desire for someone to associate a term with something harmful. I may have the most specific intentions in mind, but they develop other connotations because of how other people use the terms that are well beyond your control. And so I'm always curious about.
I don't know if it would be harm. I don't know if I would use the word harm.
But there may be people for whom it does represent some level of like, it's too negative, or it doesn't encompass the this type of thing, which like I'm getting a little far afield here, because I am more curious about, like, do you, when it relates to your work and how you in your work want to engage with people using terms like deconstruction, like you talked about in physical spaces, perceiving things through a racialized lens. And I think we carry that into our online spaces, and that's absolutely
unequivocally, yeah. And then it's exacerbated by the algorithm, right? That's Michael O. Emerson and Corey Edwards, I think, both of them. Divided by Faith is Michael O. Emerson's book, but white evangelicals have the least diverse friendship networks, somewhere around, and I tested this too, ad hoc, 95% sameness, 92 to 95% sameness. I did that on social media profiles, like how many people are white, and it's the same. And so that's just again, that's not
right.
His book is science. Mine was just counting a few. That's a problem. And I think that would be my critique of the hashtags, in that there is a push against powers that have sought less of you in the church experience, that have harmed you in the church experience. And I think one of the critical, to be the broken record, pieces we have to contend with as to why that happened, and also how we can prevent that from happening again, is to contend with our white supremacy. And if we just surround ourselves with the same voices without branching out, we're going to replicate the same problems. That's inevitable. We need diversity of people to come through and glimpse us a better way. And that's not going to come from within the tent, as it were. So that's the critique of that. But when I look at that constellation, as you said, of hashtags, I see deconstruction being more diverse, not entirely, but a little bit more diverse. Decolonization is certainly not a Christian term, so that's all sorts of different things in there. There's always a danger of any term, but decolonization, for example, being stripped away from its meaning, as institutions rob it from its meaning and try to make it something it's not ought to be. Part of that is kind of work as well. Like, we all have different work to do. Arguably, white people can't decolonize anything. You can't decolonize from something you automatically inherit. It's like whiteness. You can't just divest yourself and say, I'm not going to inherit what is automatically bestowed. You can contend with that. You can fight with that and say, I will divest myself from this. I will put my body on the line for a different way. But can you decolonize? Indigenous folks don't decolonize anything. I don't think they reclaim. So yeah, those are all just different stories of different folks. I haven't found one. I'm not the expert in hashtags, but
right. I mean, they're yeah. I don't even know. I don't know who is a hashtag expert.
Well,
to be honest.
I thought that was your book.
I mean, as far as what is going to be, what predicting virality is, I don't know that you can. Like, literally, we've lived in the chaos of a physical virus for the last 2 years. Like, even the idea even the idea of virality is something to be desired is, I think, questionable at this point. Like,
that's another good chapter in your book.
So
write that one down. That's a good
one. I will. I will write that one down. Yeah. There was another thing I was going to build off of. You see, this is the thing about,
I got going.
This is the thing about complimenting a Midwesterner. You throw them off their game. Like, we don't know how to accept about compliments. Oh my gosh. All right. So I think it, like, the thing that fascinates me is the fact that a lot of these conversations have been going on for a long time. Like you mentioned with the emergent church. And I read a book, or listened to a book rather, recently, called The Kingdom of God Has No Borders by Melanie McAllister. And it's about global evangelicalism, really from the perspective of the impact of American-based missions in other parts of the world that then over time create more local forms of evangelicalism. So meaning like in the 1960s in Africa, there were decolonization discussions. Using those terms, saying we don't want the American missionaries to be leading our churches. We can do this ourselves. We have the resources, we have the faith, we have the institutions. We want to lead ourselves. And then that these conversations keep cycling through.
It's a cycle. Yeah.
So I do want to circle back though to have you talk about your book, because you've talked about this aspect of being on the margins, and your book is called When We Belong: Reclaiming Christianity on the Margins. And I think one of the most salient critiques of evangelical deconstruction spaces by BIPOC commentators is that how people of color relate to faith is very different than how white people relate to faith. And some white people who deconstruct also deconvert, and that's the healthiest option for them. But there are other types of indigenous spiritualities or other types of spiritualities that are more resonant with people who are not white. So I'm not sure if that plays into your book, but just tying into like what I know other folks have said in regards to, a lot of white ex-evangelicals also being ex-Christians instead of maybe.
Yeah, that's I think separate than your first question pertaining to a difference of experience or spirituality or religiosity.
Yeah, take it any direction you want.
Yeah. So my book is focused for folks on the margins, and initially it was written for BIPOC folks, but then maybe it's COVID related, stretched it to say, okay, if you have ever faced a weird moment in church where a part of your being was pushed to the outside, you may have experienced marginalization. So that is a wide group of people. Could be around thoughts. So you have a particular theological strength. So that would be anybody. But then you think of other minorities. It could be gender minorities. It could be by sexuality. It could be by race or ethnicity. And so I do cast a wide net around the experience of weird moments in churches. Where I go, though, is through a process of naming. So I write a book on deconstruction. I give you a process, not a formula, but I say, we ask the questions around what to trash, keep, and reclaim. And then once we pull the veil back and we see the guts of the institution, or we dig deep enough to hit bedrock, we need to start naming the problems. Because if we don't give it name, we'll replicate them. And so that's part of the problem with all these hashtags. It's like, give name that white supremacy is at bedrock and deal with it. One of the pieces connected with white supremacy is Christian supremacy, and how Christian supremacy has now been formed in white Eurocentered or American-centered thinking. That's important because, ironically, for those who, and if you need to go, you got to go. If you deconvert, you leave Christianity entirely. I mean, I can't imagine the pain of that and the abuse you must have faced to have to face that choice. And that was the most life-giving choice too. So I'm not saying that is illegitimate by any means, but a lot of conversation around deconstruction and the fear of the institution, which we don't care about, but is this notion that you're going to deconstruct yourself out of Christianity. And you might. But that's like a form of Christian supremacy, in that the assumption is your experience could or amounts to the entirety of the Christian faith, that there couldn't possibly be other traditions out there rooted in black and brown traditions, or traditions that are rooted in resistance or justice, or ways of being that are formative into a better way of living or being human, of being whole, that there aren't options out there, and there are. And Jesus is too big for me to push him away because a bunch of white dudes screwed it up. Now I'm being crass now. It could be anybody. Anybody can screw it up, right? And people do that, and they bring huge harm. Is there a possibility of reclamation? And so I offer some ideas. Again, I don't have formula, but ideas that look at the Black church tradition in America, birthed on North American soil out of resistance. Is this not an option for you to consider when it comes to reimagining Christianity in a new way? Well, of course it is. Now they have to contend with their own problems, right? But is it an option? Yeah. The other, I do a few of those, but I also appeal, and you mentioned it, to indigenous spirituality. They're really unique stories. Of course, you can't create a monolith. By me, the Stoney Nakoda Nation, which is part of Banff. I mean, we call it Banff now, but the Stoney people, the mountains in the Banff region are part of their creation stories. And surprisingly, the early missionaries that came to the region, they actually had a good relationship. So this is before residential schools. This is before all the calamity of colonization. There was a good relationship because, well, one of the missionaries was indigenous. And also they just said, here's a good book. Do with it as you will. And the way of Jesus came to coincide. It came to work with together in relationship with the indigenous ways of being as well. And it created something beautiful temporarily. So there is at least a hope or a story connected to a different way of being within indigenous spirituality that can reclaim a Jesus that offers life. So all that to say that there are possibilities out there that aren't rooted in white hegemony that are worth reclaiming. And I'll do that imperfectly, totally, all the time, imperfectly, that I do those things. And as a church planner and church, and this is something we wanted to talk about on what does community online look like now. But like we're trying to embody a new ethic, the ethic of Jesus in church community in our messed up world. And we're making progress. There are beautiful things in spite of all of our imperfections. And because relationships are so messy, it's mess, but it's also good. So somewhere in the mess, there are these possibilities onto better. And they're worth chasing. I don't know when that happens, especially for someone who has gone through trauma, hurt, grief, pain in their church experience. I don't know when that happens. It doesn't have to happen. But just know that there are possibilities to reclaim out there. There are options.
Yeah, and I think that's great. And I think that books like that are and will be valuable for a very long time, because they're, no matter how you sort of reckon with things, whether your heart, as you mentioned, like people that may listen to this show are very likely heartbroken about something that was significant to them at one point.
Yeah. That's why you're here. Isn't that something? That's another, you did the hashtag, but you also did this podcast. And that's probably an aspect that everyone shares with their experience.
Right. And my approach has always been open-ended. Just like you said, like if you have to leave. But if you're looking for something to fill that particular role in your life, there are other aspects of spirituality, including different forms of Christianity that can do that. So that's really cool, and I can't wait to learn more about the book. When will it be coming out?
When We Belong will come out mid-June, June 15 maybe, but mid-June. So it's just wrapping up now as we record. Yeah, it's coming. I don't know if there are many books, like we didn't name it on deconstruction or something, but if there are many books, especially written by authors of color on deconstruction and also paving a pathway back. So that's kind of where I lend my voice, and that will be a particular person, I think, who's going to find value in this story. But 650 million impressions, Blake, come on. Even 1%.
We could get a slice. Yeah.
So if I had the TikTok, what is TikTok? I thought about it.
It is a fun site. So, but yeah, this will be a great addition. And what I think is always really good about books is that they have a different sort of life cycle than the sort of short half-life of podcasts and things like that, like or memes or whatever. Like people can, once it's out there, it'll be out there for a long time. So, and sort of as you mentioned in your own story, like some of these things that led to what you put in your book took you years to parcel out. And like the thing that's so interesting about this moment is like we always sort of had books or movies or things like that, and now we supplement that with like this crazy ongoing constant conversation that happens all the time, and it leads to cool things like the fact that you reached out to me a few months ago and I had the opportunity to do the same here. And I mean, I'm in like a Chicago suburb and you're in Calgary. Like I would not have, we would not have had that opportunity otherwise. So I want to recognize that too. Like,
yeah, that's true. Well, that's like church community as well as like, okay, so the whole missional church idea is incarnate presence, touch, feel, get away from consumerism, embody. Well, how do you do that in COVID? But one of the things you always slammed was online church. It was lazy. And then COVID comes around. And it was not only COVID, but the way the internet has drawn people into my church, my first church plant, and the relationships that are there, people found it through the internet, through the website, through Twitter. And they're still together 10 years later. My second church plant, same thing. And now, of course, it's all online. We're not in person. And we're figuring out what this whole spiritual dynamic deconstruction specifically as well in this community looks like online, and how to be church. And we haven't figured this one out, to be church fragmented by space, but drawn together around the same affinity and same beliefs, roughly, even existing in different cities. We actually have half of our community right now is in a different city, and the other half here. And then there's individuals all across Canada. There's someone from the US just drawing in. Like before, that would be like, that's so disembodied, that's never going to work. And now it's just like, forget about all that. Is there beauty in here? Can disabled people finally draw in without all the extra barriers? Can we talk about things in the intimacy of our own home? Like, there's beauty happening with this online stuff. So I repent. Now I can put it on the internet in recorded format. Like I was a guy who was like, online church that big churches are doing is lazy. But now it's like, wow, man, I got to repent of that. There's so much goodness happening in the midst. And of course, it would be better if we could sit around the table and do the same thing. But this has also given us life in a time where we need, we need it.
Yeah. This is a random connection to make, but bear with me, and then we can wrap things up. That I came across this book because it's actually a sci-fi book, because I came across a profile of the author in Wired magazine. The author's name is Ada Palmer, and she's a history professor professor of Renaissance history at the University of Chicago. She wrote a series of sci-fi books called the Terra Ignota series. And it has some really fascinating ideas in it. It basically takes place in the 25th century on Earth, and a few significant things have happened in the interim between the 21st and 25th centuries. First, it's illegal to use gendered, to reference any people's gender publicly. Like, everybody uses they, them. And there is no public expression of religion because of the church wars in the 21st century. There are still these like type of pastoral type figures called senseiers that you can have philosophical and religious conversations with. And they're basically like religious counselors. But then beyond that, like, there's also the final sort of pieces that this author creates for this new world is there are hypersonic flying cars. So distance means nothing. You can work anywhere in the world and you're like 2 or 3 hours away. And the nuclear family is no longer the main thing. They have these, the main local unit is called a Bosch, which is like a derivative of, I think, Bashido from Japanese. It's like a small unit of like 4 to 20 people that live in a house or someplace and raise people collectively. But to me, this very idea, what's really animating about it and feels resonant is the way like people do forge connections online. And there are lots of downsides. You know, there can be online drama that can be really traumatic. And freaking sucks. But at the same time, you can also connect yourself to either a small community that's intentional, like a church, or a broader public of people who relate to you through some sort of shared experience. And both of those, all of those things can be true all at the same time. And it's like fascinating and scary and exciting all at the same time. So I'm sorry, I haven't had a chance to really thank you for listening for a couple of minutes while I nerd out about this book that I'm like super into right now.
I mean, now I've been dabbling in fantasy and sci-fi, so I might be going on the list.
Yeah, it's the first book is called 2 2 like the lightning, and it's fantastic. I'm in the middle of it right now. But this has been a really fascinating, really broad conversation. Rohadi, where can people find you online, find your podcast, or anything else you might want to mention here?
Yeah, well, buy a box of books, give them to all your friends, give them to your mom's, buy a bunch of coloring books because my garage is full of them. But other than that, yeah, would love to hear from folks. If this podcast resonated with you, you can find me. I'm always on Twitter at Rohadi. I haven't been able to buy the Instagram version, so it's rohadi.nagassar. Those are the two places. Rohadi.com is the website. I don't have much there in terms of posts. Used to do, is blogging in still? Like, I'm not blogging anymore. I have a newsletter that comes out every 2 weeks. I have a newsletter with reflections. So that's actually my blogging. I guess I saw all the cool kids doing that. So I was like, I'll do that. And so I offer some reflections and about the world. It's mostly what I'm feeling. And so you can find that at rohadi.com. Yeah, connect in on any of those and say what's up.
Awesome. Rohadi, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.